This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
We're going to go mid-conversation here. I was listening to it was a New York Times podcast this morning. Ross Douthat is on with a couple of the other journalists there, and they were talking about the possibility of aliens and the possibility that there's conspiracy, that the government is hiding it. And I'm actually open to the possibility that there's life out there in the vast universe, but there's no way there's a conspiracy if for no other reason than Donald Trump was president for 4 years. There's no way he would keep his mouth shut about that. So anyway, but we can figure out that in maybe a minute, and then why God allows suffering in about 2, and we should be good to go.
Let me guess, was on that conversation with Ross Douthat, was he on the fence in terms of where he ended up on the
I didn't get quite that far. I think they took it in good humor. So I have to finish the rest of the interview. And he has some pieces that he's either written about it already or he's preparing. So it'll be interesting to hear his take on it.
I think Ross's position would be that he is against the people who are against the people who are against the idea that all of the stupid people believe in the conspiracy.
Anti. Okay. All right. I'm following. Let me do our intro really quick. Welcome to the special edition of Talk of Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. I am your host, as you might be able to tell, Corey Nathan. And in all sincerity, it's an honor to have conversations with the kinds of folks we have on the program today, and especially the kinds of wonderful human beings we'll be discussing. Our program is a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And as always, it'd be so helpful if you hit that subscribe or follow button in your podcast app. If you're telling someone about our show, just say to look up Talking Politics with an apostrophe after the end. In Talkin', TALKIN apostrophe politics. We talk politics and religion without killing each other. That helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation, like the very meaningful one we're having today with Jonathan Rauch and Peter Wehner. We're so fortunate to be joined again by these two fine gentlemen. John Rauch, as you'll remember, is the author of numerous books, including The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, which, by the way, I don't know if you saw the note, Russell Moore engages in his upcoming book. So you get I'll call you John Rauch, page 82. John is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer at The Atlantic, among other publications. Pete Wehner is also a contributing writer at The Atlantic, as well as the New York Times. He's a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum and the author of several books, including The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. But today we'll be actually speaking of attributions. Your book and your work, Pete, came up in an interview I was listening to within the last 6 months of Tim's life, Tim Keller's life. So today I'm already sort of teasing it. We'll be talking about two men, both of whom were at the top of my list of people I wanted to have on this program, talking about Michael Gerson and Tim Keller. Sadly, we lost both gentlemen within the last year. Mike passed away last November. Tim died just last month. But we're lucky to have John and Pete here because they were all friends and had a big impact on each other's lives. So number one, thanks so much for joining us again, John, Pete. It's so good to be with you. I consider you friends now, and it's a blessing to consider you such.
It's great to be with you. Thanks.
Me too, Corey. I'm happy to be here, especially to talk about these two amazing humans.
Yeah. So I thought a good way to start would simply be to have you introduce our guests of honor, Michael Gerson and Tim Keller. And if you want to do it the other way that I thought, but I'll tell you what my thinking was. One, John, I referenced an article you had in Religious News Service. I think that's the name of the publication, a tribute to Tim. So I thought I'd have you introduce Tim to our audience. I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with Tim Keller and his work. And Pete, maybe you could start by introducing Michael Gerson because you work together so closely.
Sure. I met Mike in the mid to late 1990s. I was at Empower America at the time, which was a conservative think tank. And it was co-chaired by Gene Kirkpatrick and Jack Kemp and Bill Bennett. And I had worked with Bill and I was policy director. And Mike was doing speeches for Jack Kemp, and he came into the office, and we had a mutual friend who introduced me to Mike. And I remember the first conversation that we had, and among other things, we talked about Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a great British journalist of the 20th century, who had started on the left and had migrated to conservatism, and he had become a Christian over the course of his journey. And so we had a really fascinating conversation about Muggeridge. Not that many people were really familiar with Muggeridge's work. Mike's insights were really good, and I just really connected with him, and that began the friendship that we had. That was probably the closest of any that I had over the last 25 years. We talked all the time. We worked together. We were colleagues. In the Bush administration, he was the chief speechwriter for President Bush. He hired me as his deputy director. I did that for a year and a half, and then I took another position, but we worked extremely closely in the White House, and we stayed in touch afterward. We co-authored books together. We co-authored essays together. We emailed a lot and spoke a lot, and he really became an intimate friend, someone whom I admired and liked and delighted in his company.
It just occurred to me that you were working in the White House during the years that The West Wing was running. Did you happen to watch that show, and how unrealistic or realistic was it?
Oddly enough, I never watched it. I didn't have a particular longing to do it. Maybe because I worked in the West Wing. Maybe it wasn't, or so. Maybe I didn't have a particular need to see how it was portrayed. But others that I know that watched it actually thought it was a pretty good representation of what was going on. I should clarify, my office was in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, but of course I was in the West Wing a fair amount.
Yeah, I would imagine being in the trenches together, so to speak, brought you and Mike pretty close.
Yeah, it really did. Yeah, it really did. When you work in the White House, and maybe even especially in speechwriting, just because of the nature of that job, that brings you together. But as I said, we were very close before it started. We were very close afterward, and it was a friendship of a kind of Aristotelian view of the three elements of friendship, and I think that his and my relationship had all of those elements. So I miss him to this day, and he lived an admirable life, and he was extremely admirable as he walked toward death as well.
Mm. And John, feel free to jump in if you have questions, but before we get too far down the road here, would you mind introducing our audience to Tim Keller?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Tim Keller was a pastor. He was a Christian apologist, meaning someone who explained Christianity to people who weren't necessarily believers. He was a theologian, someone who thought and wrote deeply about Christianity. And he was a church planter. He was possibly most famous for founding Redeemer Church, which was an evangelical Presbyterian church in the heart of New York City in Manhattan, which, is supposedly the maw of the secular world, which is, most resistant to Christianity, and built a large congregation there, and then embarked on seeding other congregations in other places. So he was also an organizer and activist. I did not know Tim the way Pete knew Mike, or for that matter, Tim. I only met Tim once in the flesh at a meeting in Washington where we were kind of across the table from each other. But it was just very quickly apparent to me, even in that formal setting, that this was a man of extraordinary depth, and that he could talk about Christianity in a way that bridged the Christian world to my world. I'm an atheist. I have been since age 5. I'm a Jew though. I'm I don't doubt my Jewish identity either. There are a lot of Jews who don't believe in God. It's kind of okay in Judaism. Um, and but I identified as Tim as someone that I could connect with. Later on, in the past 3 years or so, over the pandemic period, I got to know Tim because we both became members of a Zoom group of pastors and journalists and people who are in the world or around the world of religion, some seminarians. And we'd get on and talk about, sometimes the small questions in life, like personal problems. But very often we talk about the big questions in life, like, why does God allow suffering? This is a question that, we might get into. I don't know, but to me, it's one of the two great disqualifying puzzles of religion. And Tim had a knack for going deeper on these issues than I think really anyone else I knew. He had so much learning, but he was also so honest about them. He never cheated. He never cut corners in order to understand or explain his faith. If he didn't know the answer, or if he just thought he might be wrong, he would say so. So he kind of brought me into his world and allowed me to understand, maybe better than anyone else has, except possibly Pete Wehner, who's on this call, how Christianity can make sense.
I'm curious, a lot of apologetics really comes down to not contentious debate, because it derives from one central quote in the Bible that talks about being always ready to make a defense for the hope that's within you, but with gentleness and respect. But it really does come down to winning a contest of rhetoric. But it sounds like your experience, you described Tim Keller as an apologist, but it sounds like his flavor of apologia, if you will, it was a different one. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it was completely different from that. I never felt that Tim was talking to me in order to argue, or for that matter, to convert. I always thought that Tim was talking to me and everyone else I saw him interact with in order to listen and to understand. And he was curious about people as people. I think that's part of what attracted him, people to him as a pastor. He wasn't going to tell you what Jesus said you had to do with your life. He wanted to understand your life and then help you understand how Jesus could be part of that life.
So that's interesting that in your conversations, you never felt like he was, for lack of a better word, evangelizing to you, or even trying to convince you necessarily. But would you say that you were persuaded on certain topics or points that you had arrived at, or at the very least, did he cause you to question certain conclusions that you had arrived at?
Well, yeah, but kind of indirectly, on the core issues of why I'm an atheist, it comes down actually to my psychological makeup, which is that, I think for a lot of people, belief in God adds a certain richness or dimensionality or quality of life that I don't experience. I've known since age 5 that I thought the idea that there's, a big daddy in the sky that works miracles and gets involved with our lives despite the size of the cosmos and looks suspiciously like my parents. I always thought that was ridiculous. I came to see it, though, as less ridiculous, not on sort of the intellectual grounds that we argue about, but because of respect for Tim and some other Christians like Tim. Pete is one of them. The late Mark McIntosh is another, who showed me that their relationship with God was not just intellectual. It wasn't just belief or doctrine or scripture. It was a way of approaching life. It was a way of coming at people and ideas that is humble and sincere. Now that's great, whether you're religious or not. But Tim modeled that in a way that I think I could describe as Christ-like. And that had the effect on me of kind of almost rescuing my faith in evangelical Christianity, which just crashed terribly over the MAGA period when I saw so much hypocrisy and cruelty and, joyful embrace by evangelicals, so many of them, the majority of white evangelicals, just embraced the least Christ-like figure in American public life that maybe we've seen since, I don't know, the civil rights movement, some of Bull Connor in the South. And Tim kind of brought me back from that and reminded me of what Christianity can be like. So in that sense, yeah, he was profoundly influential.
I know we've talked about this before, and Pete, I think it's something that you've grappled with earnestly and humbly. Um, if it's coincidentally in that chapter in Dr. Moore's upcoming book, it starts with something that he didn't put it this way, but something that really pissed him off. The two words "Jesus saves." He saw the words "Jesus saves" being held by a bunch of guys that were storming the Capitol. So he was talking about these two concepts: a gallows being put up, as if they were going to hang Mike Pence, in the same place, in the same march with Jesus saves. But how do you, like I said, I know we've covered some of this ground before, but how do you account for that, Pete?
Human depravity, I suppose. I think when you're carrying a sign that says Jesus saves and standing under a gallows, those things are not reconcilable. And in that case, I don't think it's particularly complicated. What's happening here is that faith has been so massively deformed that it probably doesn't constitute faith in any serious way. It's a cultural or a psychological or sociological phenomenon. But it's not just that faith has been subordinated. I think faith has been shattered. And people, it's like putting lipstick on a pig. I mean, it's taking some of these really nasty, ugly, dark sensibilities and sentiments and saying, well, they're in this case they're Christian, and they're not. Look, everybody falls short. Everybody struggles. Nobody's perfect, but if you are living a life that on deep and fundamental ways is antithetical to the teachings of Jesus, then you're not really a follower of Jesus. Now, why people decide to claim to be followers of Jesus, why they would hold up signs that says Jesus saves, that's probably sui generis, really specific to whatever those individuals have gone through in their life and why they've decided to attach their actions and their attitudes to Christianity as opposed to something else. But Jesus said, "You'll know them by their fruits." And if you're dealing with people whose fruits are hate, then I think at the end of the day, they're not reconcilable.
So we're talking about the January 6th, but I can't help but connect that was certainly an overt abuse. I think you and I would certainly agree of the language, the biblical, scriptural language and symbols. I think that part of what we talked about last time is that one of the underlying causes or conditions, if you will, is a sense of oppositional, of a sense of us versus them. And interestingly, I was listening to tributes to Tim Keller, and they had not so subtle oppositional tones. For example, one tribute I was listening to the day or 2 days after he died talked about a talk that Tim gave at Princeton Theological Seminary,
Right.
and it was not necessarily spoken, but the understanding was Princeton Theological Seminary. I mean, talk about the left of left, or another reference to the fact that he set up shop in New York City, and there was just such an oppositional tone. Like, we're all in this joke together, this really bad joke together, because we know about all those people from New York and we know about Princeton Theological Seminary. So I don't know. Am I reading too much into that, you think, or is there something there?
No, I think there's something there for sure, because you're describing a disposition that exists, and I think it's more widespread now than it was in the past. I think it's always existed, but I think you've put your finger on something, which is these sort of seething resentments, roiling grievances that people have, and it's almost like a lightning bolt. It's got to make contact with the ground, and it's going to hit somewhere. Sometimes it hit toward Tim. Sometimes it hit toward other people. But this is why the deformation of sensibilities, of dispositions, of attitudes is so important, or the reverse of that, which is the proper shaping of sensibilities and dispositions and outlooks and attitudes is so important, because faith and biblical verses, we've talked about this before, without that can turn into something that's very, very destructive. And we've seen it throughout Christian history, and we see it today in very vivid ways, which is a lot of people who claim to be followers of Jesus are living lives that are not only contrary to his teachings, but they're doing active damage to the witness itself. And John has given eloquent voice to that. That's the importance of people like Tim and like Mike and like others, which is, as he was saying, it wasn't the intellectual arguments of faith so much. I think that is caused someone like John to view Christianity maybe not fundamentally different, but tonally different, and through a somewhat different prism. And that's because he's seen some people in which faith is central to their life and made them hopefully better, more generous, more compassionate, not perfect, but it's added dimensions to their life that are important. And that's the most powerful witness of all generally. And that's what Tim did, and as I said, that's what Mike did. But today there are a lot of people that are doing the opposite, and I think there'll be a reckoning for that one day.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Corey, it's really interesting to look at works of each of these men that we could think of in some way as maybe not literally their last words, but close. Pastor Keller, not long before he died, taped a message to, I think it was a presbytery. I'm not sure. Pete might know. You can put it in the show notes. And he says some moving and important things in his 10 minutes. But the way he winds it up is he says, don't worry about doing great things in this world. Don't worry about influence. You may think that devoting your life to God means that you're going to accomplish great things. Well, forget about it. That's not why you're here. You're here in order to celebrate to Jesus and to keep your eye fixed on the next life. And to me, from what I know of Christianity, that's a central message that has been lost. And I'm guessing that one of the reasons that Pastor Keller ended that last testimonial on that particular point is that focus on the next world and on transcendent things has been so diminished in so many ways. And similarly, Mike Gerson, his last major piece of writing, I think it's his last, Pete will know for sure, but it was a very long, very heartfelt and scathing assessment of politicized Christianity. It went right to the heart of how Christianity had sold itself out for power and how that had distorted Christian witness, how it had distorted American politics, and how difficult the road was going to be back. And I've heard people say, again, Pete will know, but that this is one of the pieces of writing that Mike was most proud of and most happy to have issued before he died. And that's really telling us something about how angry he became and how important it was for him to speak out.
Yeah, and just to build on that, John is right. It was one of the last pieces that Mike wrote. It was in September, and he died in November. But it was his last major piece. It was long. It was a 4,000 word essay in the Post, and it was huge. It had a huge readership, and probably more than 10,000 comments, I think, or they finally stopped the comment section. And what John describes is right. I'd add one element to it, and it wasn't just the anger which Mike expressed, and he did that in his writings a lot during the Trump years, because he cared deeply about those things. But it was also, in a sense, an excavation of who the real Jesus was. And I think the power for Mike of that essay wasn't just for him to express his rage at what people were doing to the Christian witness, but that he showed a different side of Jesus. And I asked him, I said, what was it that was most meaningful to you about that piece? And he said, all the people who find the Jesus of the gospel so appealing. And I think that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to clear away the debris and all of the layers and layers of ugliness that had been put on the Jesus of the Gospels, and to be able to say, this is the person we love. This is the person who's won our affections and our hearts. This is what he asks of us. And this is what a well-lived life looks like. And I felt like, and Mike felt like, he was able to convey that. And for him, that was huge, because faith was so central to who Mike was, and it was central to his politics too. I mean, he had what he referred to and is generally known as a Christian anthropology, which is the inherent dignity and rights of every human life, and that created in him a solidarity with the weak and the dispossessed, and that's a through line for Mike's entire life and in his writings. If you go back to the earliest things that he wrote, it was for the Wheaton Record at Wheaton College, where he went to school. He did a piece on Mother Teresa, and so that whole idea of justice, of social justice, of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in this world, was essential to who he was, and it led to some extraordinary breakthroughs, including his role in the president's initiative on global AIDS. Mike wasn't the only person that was key to that cause, but he was one of a handful that were. And that effort by President Bush in 2003, the Global AIDS Initiative, has saved, the estimates are 25 million lives. And if you can do that in terms of your life, and if faith is something that's sort of a piston in that engine of justice and humanity, that's a pretty powerful witness.
Yeah. No, I that piece was, I remember that piece, and it occurs to me from some of the other things that we're talking about that, whether you believe it as gospel, if you will, or just as historical literature, as if you're an atheist, that the character Jesus is, as written in those gospel accounts, would not be embraced by the MAGA movement. Do they know who this character is? So that's one of the ironies. But I have another question, and I'm curious if you've thought about this in the last few weeks and last few months. But in listening to interviews with Mike and with Tim, you're all in each other's thoughts, and you're they engage with you and your work, and vice versa. The way that you might scholars might a modern day philosopher might engage with Hegel and Kant and Descartes, but what we haven't discussed yet is whether you have what I'll call a scholarly critique of either Mike Mike's work or Tim's work. Have you given that some thought? Would you engage with their work and their contributions in a if you want to call it a scholarly way? But do you have some critiques with some of their work? Obviously, John, you being an atheist, I'm sure that there's differences. Michael and Tim obviously were both Christians, but I just wanted to open the floor for some engagement with their work on that level.
My silence is thinking that over.
Okay.
It's a new question for me. I guess the answer for me is that my intellectual and theological disputes with Tim and with Mike would have had to do with my disputes with religion generally and the tenets of religion specifically, such things as the belief in miracles, which epistemologically make nonsense of the universe as soon as you admit them, or the problem of suffering, of good things, of bad things happening to good people. I never had the opportunity to discuss those things with Mike. I actually had very few personal interactions with him. I knew him more through his public voice. And with Tim, it was more like comparing notes. The most direct conversation about this with Tim was also the most memorable to me, because I mentioned earlier his candor. He knew what he didn't know. He knew where the lines were into mystery, and didn't try to fake it. And so we were talking about the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, why a good God would, send smallpox to visit and destroy small children, or why the Holocaust. Why would God permit that to happen? Free will is not a compelling answer. Why people should be able to extinguish other people's free will by murdering them. And what Tim said was that, he could give me lots of arguments about the problem of theodicy, which is what the problem of evil is called. And he would if I wanted to, but that he thought of this problem as being like a bucket, and that everything he could pour into the bucket to explain the problem of evil, he realized would not get it more than at most 3/4 of the way full. In other words, he could not satisfactorily explain why God would allow evil. Now, for me, that's a fundamental obstacle to belief. If there were such a thing as God, as usually conceived, which is an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good being that governs the universe, then I would have to be against him, because objectively, he's created and allowed terrible things. So I come at this in a very different place than Tim did. But I was taken aback. I was a little breathtaking when he said he could only get that bucket 3/4 of the way full, because it was such a fundamental honesty about that. So I guess that's as close as we came to sort of an intellectual disagreement. Mostly it was about listening, not challenging. I don't know, Pete, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things about both. I'd say with I was closer theologically to Mike than I was to Tim, and the relationship in terms of faith was somewhat different. Tim, and I met Tim in the early 1990s, and has been a very significant figure in my life. I met him through my wife, Cindy. She was attending Redeemer Presbyterian when it was founded in 1989. And so that's how I met Tim. And then I invited Tim and his wife, Kathy, who's a very formidable person in her own right, to a small gathering in D.C. in the mid-90s on faith, Christianity, and culture. And then became closer to Tim over the years. He was part of a book club that I host, and also the Zoom conversations that John and I are part of. So I was close to Tim. Often with Tim, let me say what I appreciated about him. He and I had differences on theological issues, and as John knows, I'm not shy about raising questions about theology or any other issue in my life. I've just always been a question asker, and what I really benefit from and treasure is asking people who are more knowledgeable than I am, wiser than I am, what they make of certain issues. And so I would have conversations with Tim, email exchanges, sometimes Zoom conversations, where I would probe his thinking on issues that I disagreed with him. He was more Calvinist than I am. He was more Reformed than I am. I would say I probably see faith more through the prism of mystery and tension than Tim did. But Tim not only never shut those conversations down, he really invited them and engaged in them. And I have pages and pages of email exchanges with Tim on a whole variety of topics in which I would make my case, ask questions, explore things, and he would answer them. That's unusual. I mean, I know an awful lot of people, including Christians, and maybe even especially Christians, who just will shut down those conversations. And the harder the question, the more defensive they often get. That was not the case with Tim. I was having an email exchange with Tim and a mutual friend of John's and mine, Yuval Levin, who's not Christian, he's Jewish. Three of us were talking, and I had began this conversation, this exchange with a set of questions. And Tim said, why don't we have a Zoom conversation? So the three of us had a Zoom conversation, which lasted 90 minutes. And after that Zoom conversation, Tim sent Yuval and me a one-page summary of what we had covered and listed 5 points that I had made and raised. And then he said, let's make sure that we keep these things in mind going forward so we can continue this conversation. And what was interesting is Tim was not particularly emotive person and or emotional person, but in this case he talked about how much he cherished our friendship, and I thought that was a real insight into Tim, which is this issue in which we were having some differences on. He felt like that enriched our friendship, is how he talked about it. So I really appreciated that as well, because I think it's an attitude. With Mike, it was a situation with me. I would say that in terms of theologically and I'm not sure scholarly approach to Mike's work, but as I said, I think at the core for Mike was this Christian anthropology, this core view of human dignity and how that manifests itself, and how that shaped his politics and shaped his own life. But Mike was a person where I would try and visit him. I would go to his home on Sunday mornings, particularly in the last several months of his life, just to spend time together. I would say 80% of those conversations were on faith, not his personal faith primarily, but just faith questions. And I have pages and pages of notes where I'd say, what about this, Mike? Or what about that? And I found him to be one of the most thoughtful, he wasn't a theologian, but he thought like a theologian, and he had thought about these questions really carefully, and he was nuanced and he was honest in terms of what he thought he could answer, apropos what John was saying about Tim, and what he didn't think he could answer. And I miss that, because I felt like, I think there probably is a small number of people that I feel like kind of really understand my faith journey. And Mike was one of them. I just felt like when I talked to Mike about faith, I felt like he was in sync with me. and he could see where I was going and what I was dealing with, and he had asked many of the same questions and found many of the same sources of hope and joy. And the last thing I just want to say about both of them was, their faith was really key in their walk toward death. Tim said there were a lot of tears for Tim and Kathy with Tim's diagnosis, but Tim said that he had never had as much peace with God, as much comfort, or even as much happiness as the last couple of years in his life. Not when he was in pain from the cancer, but just it deepened his faith. And he said at one point he wanted to be cured, but he didn't want to go back to where his faith was prior to the diagnosis of the illness. And for Mike, the thing that came through to me and to others that spent time with Mike near the end of his life was this feeling of gratitude. This is pretty extraordinary. Mike had a heart attack when he was 39. He was diagnosed with kidney cancer. It metastasized into lung cancer and adrenal cancer and bone cancer. He had chronic leg pain, probably due to an operation he had for kidney cancer in 2013 that caused nerve damage, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. We joked where we said, Mike, of all the figures in the Bible, you decided to model yourself after.
Job.
You decided to choose Job. And yet with all of that, one is I never heard bitterness. He never once seemed to entertain the idea of why me. But up to the last days of his life, they were expressions of gratitude. Gratitude for the life that he led, the things he was able to do, the people that he had met. And those were sort of extraordinary witness, because that's kind of the acid test of faith. That doesn't mean people without faith can't die well, and it doesn't mean that both of them had certain predilections, predispositions that probably led them that way. But I think it's fair to say that for both of them, their faith made their journey to death better than it otherwise would have been, and more ennobling for them as individuals. And that's when you see that it's a real thing. It's not just something of the mind. It's something of the heart. It's some sort of center to who they both were.
Yeah. They were both very public with their diagnoses and their own mortality. And even from a secular perspective, it seems to me that they were both very active right up until their last days. I attributed that to them both having, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but having a sense of mission, which even from a secular standpoint, it seemed to continue to drive them. I don't know, John, did you see the same thing, or were you reading something else into their last months?
Well, I wasn't with Mike Gerson on his journey in the last month. I just knew what little I knew about how much he was struggling through Pete and a few other people who would occasionally report on it, though not in detail. I don't think Mike wanted people to dwell on his illness. Tim Keller and a sense of mission. I don't know. I guess I would wonder what Pete has to say about that. I knew Tim about 3 years, and during that whole time, he was fighting pancreatic cancer, and he knew that the odds were very slim. And actually, a couple years in, he had already survived longer than most people do. So he really knew he was on borrowed time. He was down in the Washington area for treatments regularly, using advanced experimental treatments. So he was throwing everything he had at fighting it. But what Pete just said about Mike Gerson is also true of Tim, that he would give us a brief report on how things were going, and then he'd change the subject to the things he really cared about. Whether you call that a sense of mission or a sense of being focused on higher things, or just the things that he loved in life, which was talking about religion and society and And believe me, he could. He could get deep in the weeds on, the difference between fine points of doctrine and 17th century, I don't know, apolosticism, or, I made that up. He could go on and on about that and not come up for air. So I just feel like his sense of mission was to continued engagement with the things he loved and care about in life. I didn't get the sense, Pete would know better than I didn't get the sense he felt there was a mission uncompleted in some way. I didn't really think he measured himself that way, which was kind of what gave him this, for me, slightly otherworldly quality, that his eyes were on something a little bit higher than mine and maybe yours. But maybe that's just me romanticizing him. I don't know.
No, I think that's true. I think that's a very good description. And both Tim and Mike were the same in the way that John was describing. When people are suffering, particularly when they're suffering with the kind of things that Tim and Mike was, you just have to try and calibrate as a friend what you feel like they need from you and what they need in life. And for both Tim and Mike, it was very much along the lines of what John described. They would report on their cancer from time to time. It would be important to ask them about the illness and whether they were struggling. But for the most part, overwhelmingly so, it was, here's the situation. Now let's talk about what I love and what I care about. I'll talk to my doctors about cancer. I want to talk to you about faith or about politics or about sociology or history, and yeah, I don't think there was a particular mission at the end. I think they I'm not even sure that either one would say that there was a mission in their life. They were who they were, and they lived their lives according to what they believed in, and it wasn't different at the end than it was in mid-story.
Something Pete mentioned, the word politics. I'll just interject, Corey, that from my description, it's easy to imagine that Tim Keller or Mike Gerson were saintly figures who wore sackcloth and, bore the countenance of Tartuffe or Rasputin with their eyes fixed on heaven and thumbing a rosary or what have you. Not at all. When I did see Mike Gerson, it was in political context. He was trained as a journalist. He was very engaged in the world of politics and affairs. And that's the Mike Gerson I knew, actually, the faithful Mike Gerson, the person that Pete knew. That came later and through his writings. And similar with Tim Keller, most of the conversations we had, when we engaged big issues, he would do this in a very earthy way. And often with a sense of humor, especially about himself. He'd dive into a 5-minute disquisition on the difference between 17th century preachers A and B. And then he'd pause after a while and say, boy, I really am going on about this, aren't I? Or something like that. So the guy had a sense of humor and a very practical sense of the world. I remember he advised a young pastor in our group who had just published his first book and was very excited about it. And he said, well, that's great. Congratulations. That's a wonderful thing. Now, don't write your next book for at least another 10 years, because at this point in your life, what you write today is going to embarrass you when you're my age if you're not careful.
That's right. Awesome. That's great.
Corey, can I just tell, can I tell one quick Tim Keller story? So I mentioned that Tim was part of a book club that I host. And this was earlier this year in 2023, and we were going to discuss a document that Tim had written on the decline and the renewal of the American church. And our book club gets together once a month on Wednesdays, and I got a call from Kathy, his wife, in the mid-afternoon, and she said he's really been struggling with gastrointestinal problems that were related to his cancer, and he's not been able to keep food down. He's been vomiting, and we had to take him into New York Presbyterian Church. So I'm sorry, New York Presbyterian Hospital. So he's not going to be able to join the book club tonight. And I said, obviously, I understand. Go ahead without him. So 7 o'clock, book club starts. I let everybody know that even though Tim was the person who was going to be the sort of key figure here because the document was one that he'd written, he wasn't going to be able to join us. So go around like we normally do, catch up with each other in terms of life, and we begin the conversation. Then at 7:42 p.m., I get an email from Tim that says, I'm in the waiting room at New York Presbyterian Hospital. It's really busy, noisy here, but I'm going to try and join. So I said, great. So up pops his name, no video. I tell everybody, look, folks, Tim's, here's the situation, which I told him about before. He's able to join us, but he's not going to be able to speak because he's been very ill and he's in the emergency room. But he's going to be able to listen in, so that's fine. So we're talking about this document that he had written, and I had made some observations on it that Tim didn't agree with. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, this voice emerges from the screen, and it's Tim. And he says, what you're describing isn't the gospel, it's moralism. And I said, I don't think what I'm describing is moralism. I think I'm describing the epistles of St. Paul. And so we begin this conversation, and I have this image in my mind of Tim with tubes down his throat at the hospital, New York Presbyterian, hearing these sort of heresies that I was saying, and pulling these tubes out of his throat and beginning to speak. And so he was with us for about 35 minutes and was typical Tim, insightful and engaging and fun. And then finally he had to leave the conversation because he was in the hospital. But that underscored a lot of different things about Tim. But one of them was how much he was interested in these conversations and discussions, the things of the mind, and theology, and how much he thought it was important to correct my heresies as well.
Yeah. As you mentioned, the book club, I would love to be a part of that book club or the Zoom calls, but the Groucho Marx principle kicks in. Any club that would have me a member, I'm immediately suspicious of that club. But one of the things that I took note of, one of your tributes, I think, it was to Tim. You were talking about that interaction that you had along with Yuval Levin, and you quoted Yuval Levin said, "We unavoidably." This goes to something that you were saying before, John. Yuval Levin said about Tim, "We unavoidably spoke across the line that separates Christians from Jews, and yet Tim approached that line like a low fence between friendly neighbors, the kind of fence you'd stand at for hours to chat about what matters most in life, not a high wall that divides." So that's one of the reasons that I've been a student of their work for years and wanted to have each of them on my show for different reasons. But part of it was just that they embodied, I think, what we're trying to achieve, like the question that we're trying to answer with this program, talking politics and religion without killing each other in a different way. So before we close, I'd love for you to answer how you think Mike and Tim might answer the what I call the TP&R question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps nurture relationships with people across our differences, people who think differently than we do, have different beliefs than we do, get their news from different sources than we do? How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
Well, I'll go first so that Pete can have the last word. I can't tell you what they'd say, but I can tell you what they modeled. Certainly what Tim Keller modeled, which is starting from a place of genuine curiosity, not starting from a place of I'm right and you're wrong. And that is curiosity of that kind, human curiosity. Tell me your story. And then let's compare notes. That is rare, whether you are secular or religious. David Blankenhorn, the founder of Braver Angels, which is a national grassroots depolarizing movement that's really kind of amazing. He said that what he has learned doing that work is that the best question to ask to start a conversation that could be difficult across a disagreement is, what is it about your life experience that makes you have the opinion that you do? What is it about your life experience that brought you to this opinion? That translates the axis from confrontation to curiosity. It shows interest in the person as a human being. And it means you're talking about stories instead of facts. And we are storytelling creatures, first and foremost, not fact-based creatures. And that's the way Tim just always talked to me. That's how he approached me, human to human, curious. Really, why? He would say. And to me, that's the starting point for everything else. I've long said one of my slogans in life is that what you believe matters a lot less than how you believe. And Tim and Mike, I think, modeled that.
Yeah, this is a beautiful tribute, and that's very much my view as well. The curiosity, epistemological humility. They didn't overdo it. They had convictions, they had views, but they weren't arrogant about it, and they didn't think they were perfect. I would say that in terms of what they modeled and what's relevant to the rest of us is captured in something that I think we've talked about before, Corey, and it's the Owen Barfield C.S. Lewis relationship. Barfield and Lewis had differences on pretty esoteric issues, but they had intense disagreements. They were very, very close. Lewis's, I think the first book that Lewis wrote that he dedicated was to Owen Barfield, who he said is my first and greatest teacher. And in Surprised by Joy, his autobiography, Lewis talks about Barfield and he going at it hammer and tong late into the night with these disagreements. Barfield was what Lewis referred to as a second friend, not the person who's your alter ego, but your anti-self. You start the sentence, you read the same books, and the other person draws all the wrong conclusions from the book. But the interesting thing was, Barfield said later, he said, Lewis and I never debated for victory. We debated for truth. And that's an entirely different way to view discourse, dialogue, and debate, which is not, I have the truth and you don't, and I'm going to try and overwhelm you or pummel you with arguments. It's whether in discourse and conversation we can together refine each other's views, calibrate each other's views, and come somewhat closer to an understanding of the truth and reality of things than we would without each other. And I think if you have that kind of an approach, that can make all the difference. And I think Tim and Mike, imperfectly for sure, but they kind of embodied that. They were people who at the end wanted to know the truth. And I think that was true of their politics. I think it was true about faith. I think it was true about their life in general. And when you encounter people like that, you're always going to have richer encounters because of it. You know, if the rest of us can model that, this country would be in a lot better shape.
Well, that's a great way to wrap this conversation up. I hope it's the first of many. I just really appreciate you taking the time. We'll get you out of here for that wonderful event with your family, Pete. But I really appreciate seeing you as always. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks a lot. It was great being with you and John. Thanks, John.
An honor. Thank you, Corey.
You bet. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, hit the subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about us. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's politicsandreligion.us, www.politicsandreligion.us. Now go talk some politics and religion, just like we did here, but with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.